Good evening. Is it on? Getting a few more chairs will wait a second. It's okay. Good evening. If you're, there are a few more chairs being placed in the back, and there's lots of empty spaces up front, so please feel free to fill in and move up. Is it on? Okay, thank you. Well, my name is Joe Coletti, and I'm going to welcome you to the colloquium. This is indeed an honor. The College of Agriculture and the experiment station for the university really is committed to sustainable agriculture, and I think this is tonight a very important topic. Although we know the weather's changing out there, I think we could all agree too that the climate is changing, and it's an important topic to know exactly how that relates to agriculture and sustaining our natural ecosystems, our human managed ecosystems, and all the people that depend on that. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the podium Jerry DeWitt, my colleague, who's the director of the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture.
Thank you, Dean Coletti. It's indeed a pleasure, to be here tonight with our special honored guest to speak to us tonight and dialogue with us on this issue at hand on climate change and solutions and learning of that. There's several housekeeping duties before we begin. Number one, I think most of you have received this, but we do have ample copies of our guest remarks tonight. Please feel free to take the copies for your use. Second of all, what is really helpful to the planning committee for this colloquium is if you would take a few minutes to jot a few comments and give us a brief evaluation, and just put that on the table when you leave. That would be of immense help to us as we plan next year's colloquium. Got a few things I want to tell you about before we make our introduction. First of all, the reason we have a PESHIC colloquium is on sustainable agriculture is because of the hard work of one particular individual plus others here at Iowa State University, and this individual is Dr. Lorna Butler. Lorna has just stepped on as the Henry A. Wallace Endowed Chair for Sustainable Agriculture. She served in that position for some 7 years. She has just retired. I don't quite believe that, but she and Bob are going to be going back to, I think, British Columbia and pursuing other interests and activities. But it was through Lorna's hard work and vision and dedication that she said we need to form such a colloquium to honor John Peshick and move sustainability across to Iowa. And I'd like to acknowledge the hard work of Dr. Lorna Butler. Lorna? Thank you very much, Lorna. The John Peshick colloquium on sustainable agriculture has become a tradition. This is the 7th annual, as you can see, the 7th annual colloquium. Our theory on this one is we engage and have dialogue here on campus with students, faculty, staff, guests, and then we want to take this to a community around the state. We've always taken this to another community. We were scheduled to go to Dordt College tomorrow morning, but because of the weather, we're not going to go up and talk about climate change because we're afraid of the weather on the way up there. So I'm sure Cynthia will have some comments for us on that one. But this will be the first year we have not been able to engage at the community level on that. But we'll be back on schedule hopefully next year. But this Peshick Colloquium, it honors just an outstanding individual, and we're going to embarrass him a little bit because he's here tonight, and we want to pass on a few remarks for those of you who may not have had the honor to work with, associate with, or speak to John Peshick. John is a professor emeritus of agronomy here at Iowa State University. He's been nationally recognized for his contributions in the field of agronomy, especially soil fertility, crop production, and the economics of fertilizer use. We talk in terms of leaving a carbon footprint across the world. I think John Peshick has left a Peshick footprint across the world with all the students and the wonderful contributions he's made literally in most every nation in the world. When you travel the world and you say agriculture, two names usually come up: Iowa State University and John Peshick. And John has made that contribution for all of us. In the 1980s, Dr. Peshick chaired a National Research Council committee this was with the National Academy of Sciences, their board in agriculture, and they did something very daring, very daring. They said, we're going to look at some alternative farming systems. And through a series of case studies and hard work with about 17 other individuals, John chaired this. John chaired this committee, and up came this report called Alternative Agriculture. Now, if you're in the sustainable ag world like I am, if you say the Green Book, people will know what you mean by the Green Book. The Green Book is Alternative Agriculture, National Research Council, and this came out in 1989. And this was really a groundbreaking report that documented how alternative farming systems could not only be profitable, but could be productive. We could use less purchased inputs, and they could compete. This changed agriculture. This changed how we do our agriculture in Iowa and in the world, and it's moved us towards sustainability. There's a few individuals still, I would say they have not read the book. If you read letters to the editor, like to the Daily Today, if you read letters to the editor in the Des Moines Register, I would say some of the people have not had time to read the book and have not quite come on to this thing called alternative ag. But John Peshick has made this contribution. Let me tell you a little bit more about him, then I'm going to introduce him. He's a fellow of the American Society of Agronomy, the Soil Science of America, and Crop Science of America, the Iowa Academy of Sciences, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He served in presidential roles in the ASA, the American Society of Agronomy, and the Soil Science Society. He helped through his efforts to get the National Soil Tilth Laboratory here at Iowa State University. More than 75 publications to his name. He's traveled and worked in more than 19 countries. He was our Charles F. Curtis Distinguished Professor here in Agriculture at Iowa State University. John Peshick is this. He's a professor. He was a department head. Few know that he was an interim dean. An interim dean. Remember those days? You do, okay. Interim dean. But most of all, John Peshick is a friend. He's a mentor. He's a leader to many. You'll see him every day coming into the agronomy department, working every day. And he's a voice of reason and tranquility in today and tomorrow's agriculture. John Peshick, please stand up. Thank you, John, for being with us tonight and allowing us to honor your work with this important colloquium. Our honored guest tonight, Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig. She comes to us from the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. This is at Columbia University in New York, affiliated, of course, with NASA. Her education, briefly, a bachelor's degree in agricultural sciences from Cook University, then took her master's through Rutgers University in soils and crops, and then at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, she received her PhD in plant, soil, and environmental sciences. Her work is primarily research that involves the development of interdisciplinary methodologies, which she tries to assess the potential impacts and the adaptations of global change. She's worked a lot with the models, looked at joining impact models with global climate models. And the idea is that we can do some predictions and look at future outcomes for both some of the land-based systems we have here and the urban systems across this country. I would mention, too, that she has been well recognized and a leader. Many of us at Iowa State University have known her through her illustrious career and her great work and leadership. She has organized and led across the nation large-scale interdisciplinary groups working on climate change. Presently, Cynthia is the co-leader of the Metropolitan East Coast Regional Assessment of the U.S. National Assessment of Potential Consequences of Climate Variability and Change. That would take a big business card, wouldn't it? Yeah. And she, in her own work at the Goddard Center, she is leading the Climate Impacts Research Group. So to talk to us tonight about climate change and agriculture, and not only talk with us, but hear your ideas and dialogue, is Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig. You may have to move this real close to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Dean Coletti, for the introductions. I want to start with my thank yous. I want you all to know how honored I am to be here at Iowa State in Ames. It is the heartland for anyone who studies agronomy in the whole country, and it means a lot to me to be here. I want to thank the Henry Wallace Chair for Sustainable Agriculture and the John Pesek Colloquium on Sustainable Agriculture itself. Lorna Butler, thank you very much, and Andrew Hugg, who's here, who helped on the logistics. And in this weather, believe me, there were a lot of logistics. And also old colleagues and new colleagues. Some of the people in the room, I've worked on climate change for quite a while, and also made through our discussions throughout the day, some wonderful new colleagues. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to start with a quote. It's a quote that so many people here in Iowa are concerned with. Sustainability of an agriculture that is benign in relation to world resources, population, and the environment is a serious issue, perhaps the central issue for the human race. There's one person in the audience, at least one, who knows whose quote this is, because it is John Pesek, this is from his remarks at the first John Pesek Colloquium in 2001. The specific topic for this evening is a part of that challenge that he raised. The challenge is specifically to consider the interrelation of agriculture and climate change in the context of sustainability. So I'm going to talk in this regard on three topics. First, I'd like to give a climate science update, because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, fourth assessment report from the Working Group 1, who are the climate scientists, just came out a few weeks ago, and probably many of you saw the tremendous media coverage that covered that report. So I'm going to give an update of the key points that came forward in that report, but with a focus on what they mean for agriculture. Then I'm going to describe some of the lessons that I feel I've learned from studying climate change and agriculture over these at least 2 decades, believe it or not. And then finally address strategies for solutions. Because I believe that we are in a new phase of the climate change issue. I believe we have just passed are passing in this period from the issue identification phase, which has taken about 25, 30 years since the early 80s, and we are now in the beginning of the solution phase. It's very exciting, but it's very challenging. And so that's as we launch into that end part of the talk and then into our colloquium and our discussion, those strategies for solution is really what we need to be talking about now. So here's the climate science update with the findings relevant for agriculture These are, what I'm going to be showing you are the final figures from the IPCC Working Group 2 plenary. Some of them were changed and modified right during the plenary as the governments are going through the approval process for the scientists. And the governments often say, well, we need this figure to show one more piece of information. And then the scientists respond. And so this is the result. These figures are the result of that process. So the first part of the update is that greenhouse gases continue to increase. So the graphs on the left show the increases in the greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. These are the three principal gases. The large boxes show the curves from 10,000 years ago to the present, and the little boxes inside show what has been happening since 1850. In terms of carbon dioxide, the primary source of increased carbon dioxide is fossil fuel use, but land use change provides a significant contribution. And most of that land use change, it's about 25%, 20-25%. The land use change is often related to clearing land for agriculture. So agriculture plays a role in creating the carbon dioxide emissions. In terms of methane, the observed increase in methane is due to anthropogenic activities, predominantly agriculture. These are the livestock emissions from ruminant animals and from anaerobic digestion of the carbon in rice production. So agriculture and methane are very strongly linked. Then the final one is nitrous oxide, in which agriculture also plays a role, because first of all, more than a third of all nitrous oxide emissions are anthropogenic and are primarily due to agriculture through the production and use and application of nitrogen fertilizers. So these are the causes of climate change. This graph, which is very, very complicated, is a reminder to us that all processes on Earth are extremely complicated. And when climate change is simplified to, for example, those three greenhouse gases, it's important to remember that there are many other factors and processes that affect the climate. And that's what this graph is detailing. So we see at the top the carbon dioxide and the methane and the nitrous oxide bar. These are called the radiative forcing components, bars. But then we see that there are lots of other things that force climate. So at my institute back at Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York, my colleagues are spending a tremendous amount of time looking at trying to narrow the error bars of what's also happening in terms of stratospheric ozone, tropospheric ozone, what's happening in terms of changes in albedo with land use, black carbon on snow. My boss, Jim Hansen, was very, did a lot of work on and brought forward, we have to be looking at other factors besides the greenhouse gases. There are a lot of unknowns. On the blue side, those are some things that cool climate, including the aerosols from other types of pollution, both direct and a cloud effect from that. Even the jet linear contrails are on there. Those are the anthropogenic changes. Of course, solar radiance is changing. That's the actual forcing of the sun varies, and so that's often a scientific question that's raised about climate change. Well, what's the proportion? Maybe humans are not causing climate change. Maybe it's the solar variability. But what this shows, that little line is showing that the solar variability forcing is indeed lower than the total net anthropogenic forcing, which is shown on the bottom. So there are many factors that affect climate. Now, I've just briefly starred that these are the ones that have links to agriculture, not through so much the climate part, but just these are things that folks in agriculture are dealing with. Again, this is dealing with the complexities of these processes. So just we remember this as part of part of the context as we focus in on climate change. So, of course, increases in ozone have effects on crop growth. Changes in surface albedo, that's actually a lot caused by changes when the deforestation occurs, and the changes in the albedo then due to putting in crops rather than forests and having those changes in the albedo temporally through the year. And then, of course, aerosols can have direct effects right on the crops themselves. So this is a complex situation, and it's important that we remember that as we go to focus. This one shows that the global temperature and sea level from 1850 on are rising, and that the northern hemisphere snow cover is diminishing. These are some of the actual changes in the climate that have been documented over the past approximately 150 years. These are showing the anomalies, the difference from the means of 1961 to 1990. And these are some very powerful data that demonstrate that there is inexorable warming. Linked to that, the sea level rise, which is due primarily to thermal expansion of the ocean, and then also with a contribution from the melting glaciers. And then we see a decrease, particularly in the last 10 or 20 years, maybe 30 years probably since about the end of the 1970s, on our northern hemisphere snow cover. This set of graphs is the actual proof from the climate scientists that the changes that we just saw on the previous slide are actually linked to anthropogenic causes. Because on what does the argument actually lie that people are causing these effects? In order to do this, and by the way, everything I've shown you so far are based on data. These graphs are based on both observations and results from global climate models. And what they show, and we'll look just, I think, at one on the, let's just look at the global map at the lower left. And the modelers do an experiment in which they run the models first with only the natural forcings, just the changes in the solar variability that we saw, the volcanoes going off when the volcanoes go off, just the normal atmospheric forcing, solar forcing. Then and that is creating the blue line. The model results are then shown there from 1900 to 2000. What the temperature changes would be if you only in the model experiment put in the natural forcings. Then they do the second part of the experiment in the models. You need a model to be able to actually do this because we only have one planet, so we can't do this. We can't set up an experiment to be doing this. Or we are setting up that experiment to be doing this, but we only have one realization. So in these models, we test many realizations, and the second part of the experiment is putting in all those anthropogenic forcings into the climate models, and then comparing the results of the temperature change with the observations. So the model results with anthropogenic forcings are shown in pink or red, and the black line is the observations. The only way that you can get the close match between the model simulations and the observations is to put in the anthropogenic forcings in the model. This is really the argument on which the anthropogenic warming of the past 50 years on all continents except Antarctica rests. Now, from that, all I've shown you so far has been observed in the past and the recent past and current conditions. Now, let's go to the future. These are the averages from climate models, which then are used. It's a different kind of experiment. The models then are used to continue on with projections of how greenhouse gases may grow. And with these, of course, we get a range. So first on the left-hand side, we see that was similar to, that's matching the models to the observations that we've had already. Then we do a range, then the modelers put in a range of emissions because we don't know what the future of emissions will be. Emissions depend on population growth rate, economic growth rate, technology, also changes in land use. So sets of possible future emissions are then put in, and we get a range from the model projections that didn't change it very much this time. It got a little bit higher, actually, but it's on the order of 1.5 to 4 for the main set of models. And then when you take a full set of possible emissions into account, there's the potential for going all the way up to 6 degrees warming by 2100 if we have a fossil intensive. That A1FI on this side, FI, stands for fossil intensive emissions. So we have projections of continued greenhouse gas emissions that would cause further warming. So this is what the warming looks like. First, probabilistically summarized on the graphs on the left, and then the global maps for the 2020s and for the 2090s. And we see that warming is expected to be greatest over land and at most high northern latitudes. And we see this inexorable projections that further emissions would bring. What about what's important for ag? Well, the warming is important, but the mean change is probably not as important as what would happen to the extremes. So in terms of the projections of the extremes, what the models are showing us is that hot extremes and heat waves will continue to become more frequent. What about that very important other variable for agriculture? Precipitation, of course. So what these are showing multi-model projected patterns of precipitation changes. So what these multiple model projections show, that increases in precipitation are very likely in the high latitudes, while decreases are likely in most subtropical land regions. But what about the extremes? Again, although, of course, total precipitation is extremely important for agricultural production, extremes are important too. So the projection there is that heavy precipitation events will continue to become more frequent. What about if we look at what's happening right here in the center part of the United States, of North America? What white means on these maps is that the models do not agree. And so that's why I put question marks. There's still a lot of uncertainty about future projections of precipitation, really, and I know the modelers in the room would agree. And I just want to point out that we don't. It looks as if perhaps where we are in Iowa that we're on a cusp. Maybe we're in that higher precipitation zone in the 2090s and progressing up to the 2090s, but we really don't know. I also believe that it's very important to be very clear about the uncertainties in global warming, very straight up about that. There are still a lot of uncertainties about what these climate changes mean. So those are the figures that are part of the summary for policymakers that just were presented and approved in Paris. Now, on the lessons learned, I want to turn to the lessons learned now. So I just want to say, how come I feel like I can share with you some of the lessons learned? And that's because as a young graduate student, I was very, very fortunate because I happened to be at Goddard Institute for Space Studies doing studies of remote sensing of crops. And this was at the time when the first global climate model projections were first being done of doubled CO2. And the director of GISS then, and who is still now the director of GISS, is my boss, Dr. James Hansen, who is one of the most well-known climate scientists and climate change scientists. And he is from Iowa. And he asked a question, which actually he didn't even ask me directly because it was like this in terms of levels, but it got passed down to me that Jim Hansen wanted to know what would happen to food with the projections of climate change. And so it got passed down to me because I was the only person in the building who had a degree in agronomy. I was the only agronomist. It was all full of climate scientists. So I've just been extremely fortunate in my research career to be able to work on answering Jim's question over these years. And so that's what I want to share with you, some of the things that I feel that we have learned in the 20 years about how climate change would affect agriculture. So the first lesson is that impacts on agriculture are complex. Just as I warned about complexity on the climate processes, it's the same with agriculture. Some things are possible benefits, and we have to be honest about those. Higher CO2, we all know, will be good. If it's only changes in carbon dioxide, this will be good for crop production, crop photosynthesis, and biomass and yields. With many places, ag and production is limited in many places by cold, in terms of at higher latitudes and higher altitudes. So longer growing seasons can be good for agriculture. Many places are limited in their water resources, so increased precipitation in many places will be good for agriculture, can be good for agriculture. So we have to think about those possible benefits and test them. But there are also possible drawbacks. More frequent droughts, because really what the models are showing is more an intensified hydrological cycle. So there will really actually be more droughts and more floods. Changes in pests, heat stress on our crops, faster growing periods on our annual crops. High temperature pushes the thermal growing degree days unit through the life cycles faster, which is a negative pressure on yield. And then in areas that are near the shore, increased flooding due to seawater and salinization also can increase. So when we study, we need tools when we study these agricultural effects that take into account all of these and then see what in the end balances out. And that's when Jerry was saying about putting models together and creating methods, that's what we do. So based on those complexities that I just showed you, the next lesson is that agricultural impacts are indeed heterogeneous. So all around the world, sometimes they're positive and sometimes they're negative. It's not just everywhere climate change is bad for crops. That's way too simplistic. I thought I had some arrows here, but no, I guess I don't. Oh no, it's in this one. So and when you can, so even in one country, like if you just look in the United States, there's positive effects in this particular scenario in some of the Midwest and the East Coast. There's a strip down the middle which is negative, and then the others are basically no change. So there's a lot of possibility for different outcomes. Also, because the climate, remember I showed you that range of what the climate projections could be, there's the magnitude and the distribution of impacts are also uncertain, and we have to be very honest about this. So these are from 3 different global climate models, each of which are having different temperature projections, and each are coming up with different results. So the arrows here indicate that for this part of the country, in 2 of the models, it's showing negative effects on the agriculture. In one, it's showing positive in terms of these are showing cereal production capacity. It's an index of crop production. So from everything I've told you so far, I think you might be asking, well, what do we know about climate change? Because all I've told you so far, and ag, because all I've told you so far is that it's very complicated and complex and heterogeneous. So from looking at and doing many, by now, multitudes of studies, here are some of the things that we can learn from our interactions with the models and the scientists who are analyzing them. And the overall effect of climate change will be negative in the long term. What this graph shows is it's a very generalized one, because that's important, because of the uncertainties. But what it's showing is from 0 to 10, it's the severity of climate change. It could also be time, because climate change is going to be low at the beginning and get progressively worse, is projected to get progressively worse. So the red lines are showing production potential, and the green lines are showing areal extent. What both of them show, and then they have two variants, because one of the greatest uncertainties, which I haven't talked about yet, which I'm now going to talk about on the next slide, is the direct effects of CO2 on the crop physiology. We really don't know. We need a lot more research. We still need a lot more research on the actual effect that the direct CO2 will have physiologically. But what we see in all of these studies, as we generalize them, that while there is the potential for increase with higher CO2, with the benefits of the high photosynthesis and improved water use efficiency on the crops, that the ag production may do well for a while. But then as the climate warms progressively, at a certain point, those benefits will level off, and the warming pressures on the high temperature pressures and those hydrological extremes have an effect and turn the ag production negative around the world. The issue is that we don't know, we can't say exactly where the inflection points will be. And this is very, very serious. There is tremendous debate about this among the ag scientists, for example, on the Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change chapter on agriculture, which is coming out the first week in April. And they had hours and hours and hours looking through every single study to see if they could characterize these inflection points. And the inflection points are on the order of 2 to 3 degrees C, where the inflection point will be where it will start to turn negative. This is what hundreds of modeling studies may be summarized to show. I mentioned the research issues. I won't dwell on this, but right now there's a big debate. And I'm actually on Friday going to be in a symposium with Steve Long, who has been bringing forward some of these issues with CO2. So there have been several decades of research, and we know a lot about what happens with photosynthesis, with high CO2 photosynthesis, biomass accumulation, and crop yields. However, the jury is still out concerning the real strength of these effects in farmers' fields, because in order to study these effects, the setup in the free air release experimental sites are so artificial that you can't actually answer the real question, which we need to know for these generalized global agriculture projections, what will happen in farmers' fields. And the next one, the second real question we need to know is, what are the real interactions with elevated CO2 with increasing temperatures? That's the real answer. And the free air release that are done now in farmers' fields. Colleagues Bruce Kimball and others have done wonderful experiments on this, but they don't have increasing temperature. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And then whatever we learn about the CO2 effects have to be put in context with the other drivers. For example, what in terms of market resources, trade, world food system, etc. And some colleagues feel, and economists, and I know there's some economists in the room, when they look at this, they say, look, the CO2 effects are really like just a few percent here, up and down, are not going to have a big effect on the final result, which is this long-term negative effect. The next lesson is that in all of the studies, multitudes of global and regional studies on rural groups and agricultural systems show, and we discussed this in the panel earlier today, that developed and developing countries diverge in vulnerability for their agriculture. And what is shown now by study after study is that the agricultural systems in and the farmers in developing countries are more vulnerable to climate change. And that's what we use the linked modeling studies to show this. They're vulnerable to climate change in two ways. First of all, on the impact side, and then on the adaptive capacity side as well, that the strength of the research institutions are not as strong there, and therefore not only will the impacts be worse, but then but developing the adaptations that are needed that capacity tends to be lower. In particular, and this is what we had a whole panel on earlier, Africa is the most vulnerable, due in particular to risk of hunger. What this shows is additional millions of people at risk of hunger, and this is virtually all in Africa. And what it's showing is the base case is 300 million people at risk of hunger, and then with marching through the decades with climate change, with one scenario, the potential increase on the order of 35 to 50 million more people due to climate change. This index of climate change it includes both the production of the calories and the ability of the population to purchase the calories. So it is both a biophysical and an economic index. Another part when we think about adaptive capacity, and this is one of the very important lessons that's coming on right now, is that development path matters as we prepare for climate change, particularly in developing countries. So what this is showing is 4 different reference cases of risk of hunger, and it depends on what's the population growth, economic growth, technology, and land use, and without climate change. And what you see is that depending on development, the underlying risk of hunger can be very different depending on what path towards development countries in Africa take. And so this is one of the linkages, that where those populations are is very important as then climate change comes on top. So if you have a strong development path and reduce your risk of hunger, this is going to help you and then respond and have lower risk of hunger as climate change. So development path matters. This is going to be one of the main new results shown in the Working Group 2 report in April. Next lesson, water resources are key. Of course, we all know this. But the potential for increasing droughts and floods are what need to be brought forward. Changes in seasonality, also with the melting snow that we're already having. The folks in California and the West are already dealing with earlier snow melt in their hydrological systems, and this can change, of course, the timing of the storage of the water and the delivery, for example, for irrigation. Also, again, as we project into the future these climate changes, with the water resource managers, of course, we have to put in, it's not just climate change, it's going to be changing. The competing demands with domestic users and ecosystem services with our water resources now. So, again, climate change comes in with all the other things that are going to be changing as well. And then this was one study that we did, linking models. And this was actually done, I was remembering the last time I came to Des Moines, I came to visit Pioneer because this study was done with a consortium of agribusinesses led by Pioneer. They wanted to know what was happening with climate change to the water supplies in their regions of interest. We also did regions around the world. And with the scenarios that we used for this study, the water supply was projected to increase, very similar to when we were looking at, is that line going to be increased, where is the Midwest going to sit in terms of the climate scenarios. But those increases in precipitation bring concern for things like tractability in the spring and waterlogging in the summer. And then further, the potential for excess soil moisture. So this is some work. In the beginning with climate change, climate change was going to bring drought, all focus on drought. But because a lot of the scenarios are actually showing increases in precipitation, we felt, look, we have to do some studies on what's going to happen with too much precipitation. And so this was actually one of the first papers that brought forward the potential for the problems with excess soil moisture. And just to show you that the 20% damage to yield there in terms of the number of events, the white is baseline, and then the projections for how many events would happen with the scenarios, that 20% level there is is comparable to the 1993 U.S. Midwest floods. So there is the potential with these increases in precipitation for more 93 floods to occur. One of the things when so much in climate change, you see these curves, mean changes, gradually going into the future. That is, I think, again, we have to be very careful to realize that there are going to be surprises in climate change. It is not just going to be this very smooth, inexorable rise. In some ways, there will be surprises. So when we think about our ag systems, very likely, it's hard to know what a surprise will be because then it wouldn't be a surprise. But it's very likely that pests may surprise. So X.B. Yang and I worked on, and I've worked with him on some entomology issues, some of the insects and pests, weeds and diseases, because basically all studies show that with warming there will be an increase in pest pressure. In part because you can have longer seasons, you can have more generations of pests, you can have the bottom one is showing a very important part that you don't have your overwintering isn't as strong, and so then the pests are they don't have to go as far to get warm weather, and then they're ready to shoot back into the Midwest to the major production areas. And then the one on the right just shows how quickly pests can spread. So in terms of, I think this is the next to last, the potential for surprises, and there may be others as well. And I think this is the last lesson, which is climate change is already here. What the colors are showing is the annual temperature trends from 1973 to 2002. So this is the total amount of temperature that everywhere in the world has experienced since 1970. And as you can see, and the key is from about the blue colors are about 1 degree C, and the red colors go even up to greater than 1 degree C. So when you look at this map, you can see that most places in the world already have experienced warming in the last 30 years. And so one of the questions that we are looking at in our chapter in IPCC is, have those warming temperatures had an effect? And in particular, have they had an effect on agricultural production? So there are now beginning to be documented, because these studies are actually quite difficult to do, to actually document that these temperature effects are having temperature changes are having effects on agriculture. But there are now a few looking at phenology, yields, some on livestock in Mongolia. There's some good studies there. Management practices, pests and diseases. There is documentation that the warming that we have had, and remember from working group 1, the warming that we have had is anthropogenic in nature. Therefore, anthropogenic causes are causing warming, and the warming are causing impacts already. And just very quickly, these are just the quick examples of what these changes are. So this is in Europe, in 21 European countries. Farmers are beginning to advance their activities in the spring. That's what the red area is, and this is days that they are advancing. They're planting, they're plowing, all those things that they do in the spring, more than they are delaying them. So that's very well documented, and documented statistically that there's an advance. Grape harvest dates in France are earlier. This is an amazing record from 1370. They have data on their vineyard harvests, and what you can see is that the last 30 years are lower, That means that they are harvesting earlier. That red line is lower, and this very, that line heading down was the heat wave in Europe that they had in 2003, in which they basically had crop failure on their vines, which are very important economically in Europe and France. France in particular, but Europe in general. And then Peng in the Philippines have looked at what's going on with their temperatures and rice production, rice yields, and they see that the annual mean and max temperatures have gone up in approximately the same period, and there's a close linkage between especially mean minimum temperature and crop yields, and that they have a decline in 10 degrees for each 1 degree C, and these are spikelets, above ground biomass, and crop yields at the top. And it's the minimum temperature that is having effect, as we know, rather than the max temperature on the rice. Okay, let's turn to solutions. Let's get to what are we going to do about it. So here's the first. Farmers need to mitigate and adapt at the same time to reduce risk. So there are two main responses to climate change. One is mitigate, which is reducing greenhouse gases, which is going to reduce the ultimate magnitude of the climate change, and adaptation, which means we're changing already, we're going to change for sure in the future, and we have to do a better job with our changing climate right now and in the future. So basically what we're going to be doing, agriculture production, in the middle of that graph. So we have to do both, not one or the other. On the mitigation side, there are lots of mitigation entry points in agriculture. So this is it's a kind of carbon cycle for ag. Of course, there's the energy inputs to power. There's the livestock in the field. There's the emissions that we talked about, which going beyond carbon, CO2 with the methane and the N2O. And then this cycle of the production cycle of the carbon and the use of the carbon in the soil. So there's lots of entry points and things that can be done. What I think we need to do, and I think that's what we are doing right now, is try and test multiple mitigation pathways. So first, biofuels. And I have to tell you that since I arrived from the airport, since Andrew picked me up, I have talked about biofuels. I've talked about ethanol nonstop. And it's been great for me because, we read about all of it back over on the East Coast, but to see it in action. We've already been twice to Nevada. Am I pronouncing it right? So biofuels, I'll talk a little bit more about carbon storage in agroforestry and soils, improved nitrogen fertilizer efficiency. There's so many things that can be done. Reduction of the greenhouse gases from the emissions from the agricultural operations, methane emissions reductions in rice and livestock. So the two that we're going to focus on, I think probably the two that are most focused on here in Iowa, the carbon sequestration. Some of the numbers, of course, we all know that with deforestation and cultivation, there's been a tremendous amount of carbon lost to the atmosphere. And so there are very, very rough estimates of this, and some of these I know people have done here. I think the numbers are extremely rough. These are IPCC numbers. So there's a potential, there's a limit to how much could be put back. Since most of it is we're not going to be completely putting back the forest, so from cultivation, it's probably about 50 gigatons of carbon. That may be sort of a restoration limit. And then going through the ways that we can restore carbon, crop management, just doing a better job on our crop management helps to store carbon, conservation tillage, other management techniques, of course. Agroforestry does by far the most. If we start putting back the trees, it's going to store more carbon. Grassland, changing to grasslands or other, and perennials that can play a role as well. The amount is fairly limited. It doesn't go all the way up to the potential probably, but that's probably realistic. As in everything we're learning, and we're certainly learning this about ethanol, there are caveats in these mitigation activities. There's a finite store because if we build it back up, then we can't be drawing any more down. But it's known as a wedge process to do what we can as we give us time, buy time really, that we're working on stabilizing as new technologies come on board downstream. So that maybe we could do this for 50 years, but these things are very, I think, highly uncertain. The use of energy to carry it out, anything with crop management, of course, it takes anything that takes an agricultural machine uses energy to carry it out. I think there are also compliance issues and monitoring and evaluation issues as well. I'm very much for carbon sequestration in agricultural fields, but I think that we have to be realistic and not oversell it. What about biofuels? So everyone here in the audience is an expert on different aspects of this. Clearly, very, very crucial for Iowa. Potential on the order, reduced emissions of 3 to 4 gigatons carbon per year by mid-century. The current emissions are about 7. Worldwide, maybe there's a conversion of about 200 million hectares to doing this. The issues, of course, are crop choice. There's so much discussion about that. Maybe we'll discuss more in the discussion period. Again, there are caveats. Of course, competition with food production, pollution and erosion, use of energy to carry it out. One of the things that's come up in our discussions is a challenge, and Jerry said I should challenge everyone here. I had a great talk at Leopold earlier to see if folks here at Iowa State in Ames could devise a sustainable ethanol system. What would that look like? That could be a true contribution from Iowa. Very challenging, but it would be a tremendous leadership role. So let's think about. So I was thinking about if there's, I think Nevada, maybe it's a Iowa Commodities Group that owns it. It's a co-op. And so that's a great part of sustainability. And then demonstrating in the 50-mile radius that the crops have to come, could we make that entire area sustainable? Figure out the processes, monitor, and publish it, and show it to the world. I think it would be very, very exciting, and I would love to work with you on it. Let's move to adaptation. Again, what we have to do is try and test multiple adaptation options. So what this is demonstrating is the models, because the models are very, very good on this. So, of course, we'll be doing things in the fields as well. But with models, you do climate change scenarios, you test interventions, technologies, management policies with the simulation model, and then you get possible outcomes, and we're now doing the outcomes also with probabilistic, which is showing the uncertainty, which is good. Just on the climate change scenario part, we used to have very deterministic scenarios. What this is showing is model-based probability of temperature and precipitation changes, in which we take 5 GCMs and 3 emission scenarios. So, and what this shows is that at every time period, then you can see, well, the uncertainty range, let's say in the 2020s, is 1.5 to 3 degrees, let's say, and then the central tendency is about 2. That was 1. And when we work a lot with decision makers, showing them something like this is helpful because it's encapsulating the uncertainties. It's not saying climate change is going to do this, but showing the central tendencies. And as they begin to plan adaptations, we think that this is a useful way to go. Regional climate models. We had a great regional climate modeling meeting this afternoon. This is just to say there's definitely a role for regional climate modeling to help with planning and developing the adaptations. I'm not going to read all these. These are all the things that you all know about and work with every minute, all the adaptation responses that can be tested and tried both in the field and in the models. Here's the lesson, though, of this, that I think it's important to understand that adaptation is important, but it's not always possible, complete, or cheap. And I'm looking a little bit at John Marinowski because when we work with economists, and my husband is an economist, so I can say this, I've never met an economist who didn't love adaptation. They never met an adaptation that they didn't love. And they're going, oh, don't worry, we can adapt, we're going to adapt. What our work clearly shows, and I think that when we think about how we are adapted to our present-day climate, and we are not completely adapted to our present-day climate,